Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I would like to extend that respect to all First Nations people here with us this evening. I acknowledge the Indigenous people have been custodians of these lands and waterways of Australia for over 65,000 years, and are our first educators, and I acknowledge the place of Indigenous knowledges in the Academy, something that's very important for our Faculty of Education. We're now very much settled into warring, also known as wombat season, which spans the cooler, wetter months from April to July. Because of the colder temperatures, wombats, or warn, frequently emerge from their burrows during the day to bask and graze in the sunshine. Yet to see some on our campus. With misty mornings and low temperatures, days are now short and nights are long. The rainy days feel bolin or billabongs, and you may have noticed all sorts of fungi growing lately, which, along with small tuberous plants, grow well after rain, while the ground is still warm. As our students conclude the final week of the examination period here at the university, we are reminded that learning is shaped by place, by season, and by this enduring custodianship of this land. So welcome to the second Dean's Lecture in the 2026 series. My name is Professor Marek Tesar, and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Education, also known as Melbourne Graduate School of Education, or MGSE, here at the University of Melbourne. Our Dean's Lecture series has become a vibrant forum for dialogue across the education community and really continues to attract growing interest. I have been delighted to learn that in addition to this fantastic audience, thank you so much for coming, there is about 1,200 people who have registered to receive a copy of tonight's recordings already. Although I'm not entirely surprised by this given the topic of tonight's lecture. Student well-being and the role of the schools is at the forefront of the minds of so many educators in Victoria and indeed across the country. We are extremely fortunate to have been able to align the calendars of 4 incredible experts and spearheading mental health initiatives in schools and shaping national policy. Professor Frank Oberklaid AM, Professor Sharon Goldfeld AM, and Stephen Fraser, we could not be more grateful that you have provided our education community here with the opportunity to be part of this conversation with you. I would also very much like to thank in advance Professor John Quach, learning intervention expert from our very own Melbourne Education faculty. John is an outstanding colleague, scholar, researcher, and educator, and a passionate advocate for children and young people. John's work embodies really the very theme of this lecture series, the research that makes a difference. Through his leadership in areas such as child well-being, mental health learning, and school improvement, he has helped shape practice and policy across Australia. We are fortunate to have him leading tonight's panel discussion and for facilitating the audience Q&A. So we will begin tonight's Dean's Lecture with a presentation by John, who will provide an overview of the research he and his team are involved here in the faculty and set the scene for the panel discussion to follow. A reminder that tonight's Dean's Lecture is scheduled until 7:30 p.m. and while we may conclude earlier, we do have this time set aside to allow for rigorous conversations between our panelists as well as audience engagements and questions. So I encourage you to really note down your questions during the panel segment in preparation for audience Q&A. I would also like to, in advance, thank our Dr. Georgia Dawson from our faculty for delivering a vote of thanks. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor John Quach to the stage to begin the Dean's Lecture panel event, The Wellbeing Crisis in School, What Must Change Now?
So thank you, everyone, and welcome to our Dean's Lecture, and thank you for coming to hear this. I hope to be a very compelling and interesting panel for you, but I have the privilege of starting off by just setting the scene. And what I'm going to take you through is just a very quick snapshot of some of the work that myself and my team have been up to, but also providing some provocations that I hope that you will build on as when we throw to you in terms of the questions and for our panel to respond to as well. So just starting off, and in line with the theme, we know that wellbeing in Australian children, there are some inconvenient truths. That data from the OECD shows that investment in education has been increasing over the last couple of decades. But at the same time, that hasn't necessarily been reflected in the outcomes that we hope to see, as well as a decrease in the wellbeing of our students. Now, what that means and how we unpack wellbeing, I'll kind of come to in a few slides' time. But we do see kind of trends not going the way that we would necessarily expect if you think about funding equally improving outcomes. And I guess the first thing I want to get out of the way from my perspective is that there's this notion that schools as a wellbeing platform is a very new approach or a new recognition. And I keep going back to history and thinking about how long have we been talking about schools? And this is the earliest paper I can find. I'm sure I'm going to find more as I keep digging. But this was back in 1973, where Dawes was really talking about that really having clinical support in schools only goes so far. What they were really advocating for is that group work, and that they were talking about how psychologists can do group work in schools, but that last line as well really sticks out to me, really highlighting back in the 70s, before I was born, that teachers were still being put forward as this workforce that should be caring about mental health. Sorry to age everyone. As well as in 1971, there was this really interesting project called the Primary Mental Health Project, which once again was thinking about what's the role of prevention. And prevention was this really new topic in the field of psychiatry, that actually we can do something before students or children exhibit more clinical signs. So really revolutionary at the time. But in this paper by Cohen, you can see that they advocate for 3 key reasons why schools can make a difference. And these things really are true today as well. Think about that teachers spend the most time with the students, so half their waking time. We've calculated that teachers spend about 1,000 hours with their students in front of them, even if you take away lunch and recess times. We know teachers are there too, but 1,000 hours in the classroom. And that we know that if we can support students without the need to label, that's a really important aspect as well. We know about mental health stigma, we know about the perceptions that children face in the classroom and in the schoolyard. So can we support in a way and do prevention in a way that doesn't mean we have to label students? And then that last point is really highlighting that children or students in their environment where they're comfortable, that's what's really important. That changing environments can be one of the barriers that children face. So these rationale really hold true still back right now. We know children spend the most time in schools, and we know about the importance of early prevention, but also having students in environments where they can be supported ongoingly in a supportive way. Now, one thing I do want to highlight about Australia compared to some of the other countries where I've engaged with and spoken to, and also call out to Victoria as well, is that the role of wellbeing in schools has really been highlighted in the past few years. That there's been a lot of advocacy and policy changes and national strategy documents, and really highlighting that schools have an important role to play. So it's not necessarily that it's a new concept, but I think it's a better appreciation that schools have been playing an important role, but we now need to think more deeply and carefully about how do we support schools to realise the potential that they have there. So it's really about schools and that central component that they're having, and even thinking about in Victoria, how we have learning and wellbeing as central to our framework for improving schools really highlights that teachers and schools need to think about these two concepts not as separate, but how are they intertwined and interrelated to each other. Now, I'm going to go through some slides and some things of I guess, highlighting some of the complexities that schools face. The first one is the concept of wellbeing. I'm pretty sure I could ask everyone in the audience here what you mean by wellbeing, and you'll mean something different. You'll focus on different aspects, you'll value different components of wellbeing. And one of my favourite quotes that my PhD supervisor, I don't know where she got it from, but I've heard it from her, was that frameworks are like toothbrushes. We all need one, we all use them, but we don't want to use anyone else's. And that really is one of the concepts, is when you think about wellbeing, it is that complex interplay of what do we actually mean. And that's actually when you talk about wellbeing in schools, if you're a school in one certain area and you've got certain demographics of students, your concept of wellbeing could be completely different to a school that's 500 metres up the road. And we've seen that time and time again in our research, is going into schools and saying, let's think about a common language. The common language you have in one school is different to the other, and that relies on the value that they place on certain concepts and abstracts. In saying that, this is an example from Eracy, and they did an enormous amount of work almost a couple of decades ago, thinking about what is wellbeing and looking at the student perspective. And you can see here from the NEST, which is one of the recognised ones in Australia, that wellbeing is really all-encompassing. Health is just one of those aspects up there. You can think about identity and culture, about your values. They are all things that intrinsically impact on our perception of our own wellbeing. And when we think about schools, how do we think about where's the remit that schools face? So what should be the role of schools, but also how do schools complement that ecological model? So what's happening at home, within their community, as well as other services as well. And I really want to kind of highlight that, is that when we think about the role of schools, we have to think about the role of schools within the communities in which they are a part of, and the communities in which the children are coming to through their doors. Now, some data. Sorry, I'm a bit of a data nerd, so I'm going to have to show you some graphs along the way. So this is some new study that we've been doing, looking at mental wellbeing of different students. And what I want to show you here is that we often think about wellbeing as just one construct, but in fact, it's a lot of different constructs. And even within the concept of mental health, it can be different things as well. So in this particular data, we had data from adolescents looking at these 7 domains of wellbeing. You can see some of them are positively framed, some are on the negative side. And if you look across, what those different lines represent are different profiles. So we essentially did some fancy stats. I looked at which children are similar to each other. And you can see that we came up with 4 profiles. The purple profile, which we call our complete mental health, where they had positive attributes, high positive attributes and low negative attributes. And that was about 45% of students. So there's another 55% of students who are in those other categories. So once again, showing just the complexity of when you think about wellbeing, what are you measuring and how does that relate to other factors that might be important as well. As well as this data, we looked at across the transition from primary to secondary school. And what you can see on this is that all the red text are where children, after the transition to high school, they have gone in the negative direction in terms of their well-being. And in the green is where they kind of move to a more positive area. And now we're starting to do some work to look at what are the factors that might predict whether that transition to school is actually a positive experience for some students' well-being, and what might be some of the negative experiences that might relate to that. But once again, it really shows the dynamic nature of well-being and that how life events can really shape the changes in our well-being in that space. And I always get asked the question of, well, does it matter for learning? And what does that look like? So this is a study that we did quite a number of years ago using data from the longitudinal study of Australian children. So 5,000 children that we looked at. And what we found is that what we simply did was went through the data sets and identified the number of health difficulties that a child might have when they were 8 to 9 years of age. And through NAPLAN, we're able to link it to their NAPLAN scores 2 years later. And what you can see from this graph is there's quite a distinct profile, whether you look at physical, psychosocial, or combine them together, that the more health difficulties a child has, the greater impact on their NAPLAN scores it has. And if we overlay this with data from the Grattan Institute looking at magnitude, about a 0.4 effect size decrease in terms of their NAPLAN results equates to about 8 to 15 months behind their peers. And this was across all domains of NAPLAN that we saw this pattern. So it's not only what is your wellbeing, but which attributes of your wellbeing are your meeting difficulties. And I also want to assure you that we won't just look at clinical cut points, but more functional-based cut points as well. Now, as once again, a data nerd, I really want to think about, well, if we look across studies and do meta-analyses, what do we actually see in terms of the relationship between student wellbeing and learning? Now, I've picked the 3 big ones. So the first one is the green is the subjective wellbeing. Second is student engagement, and the third one is mental health. So if we look at wellbeing, the most recent meta-analysis I've been able to find this is where the effect size is on academic achievement. It's about 0.17. So students' self-perception of their wellbeing was related to a 0.17 effect size. Student engagement was 0.27. Now, and then the final part was the 0.33, which was mental health. So once again, I think this really highlights is depending on the domain of wellbeing that you're looking at can really influence the type of impact that we see in terms of their NAPLAN, in terms of academic achievement. However, this really has also shows some limitations that I think are really important for us in terms of context for today. Is that there were less than 15% of studies actually looked at things from a longitudinal nature. A lot of it was cross-sectional, so we don't quite have that clear understanding of what's the long-term impact that we get from wellbeing to academic achievement. And once again, this is about academic achievement, so a lot of these studies were using standardised scores, we're looking at grade levels, so weren't really thinking about the process of learning. And most of the time when we think about wellbeing, we have to think about how does it enable students to learn, not necessarily what is the academic achievement of you do this. And that's where a lot of the research is a bit unclear at the moment, is how do you get from wellbeing to academic scores, and what's the mechanism there? And that's led to challenges in how we think about measurement, because we love to kind of see changes in NAPLAN, but are we measuring the right outcome at the right time point? And that's a really open question at the moment. As well as in my preference area, or my bias, is that very few studies have been conducted in children in primary school age. A lot of these are secondary school data sets. So data sets on the kind of under 9 years is really missing and really challenging to find. So if anyone's got any leads, please send them my way. But we know teachers recognise the data. So last year we conducted a study of about 450 teachers around Australia, asking them to explain a number of different things. One of those things is, what is that relationship between wellbeing and learning? So it was a qualitative project that we did, and that we've got representation across all the states. And you can see that these were really 3 key themes. Mental wellbeing is really essential to student learning, and I won't read out the quote, but you can see the teachers explain to us, like, how does you get from wellbeing to those academic outcomes? But they also, quite a number of them also highlighted the negative impact of academic pressure as well. So recognising that the way and what they mean by academic pressure, when we broke it down a little bit more, is not only the process of learning, but whether or not teachers are providing with the pedagogy that enables them to master some of the concepts which they are being taught. So this data is really highlighting us and showing us that's really a two-way relationship. It's not necessarily wellbeing impacting on academics, but we have to think about academics impacting on the wellbeing as well. So once again, that thinking about how does the teaching pedagogy in the classroom, teaching language or teaching maths impact the wellbeing of students? And that's a really untapped area at the moment. And then the final thing that the teachers really highlighted is the relationship is really important, but the concept of that school environment and school climate really came out in their responses as well. And this was pretty consistent as we were going through all our qualitative data. And once again, this is data, again, from our longitudinal study that I was talking to you about, where we looked at adolescents and that concept. So just to kind of down my right is that we were looking at different concepts such as a student's behavioural engagement, emotional engagement, school climate, their identity with their school, their perceived support from their school environment, their happiness and their life satisfaction. And we're able to do that at 3 time points across 3 different years. So we're able to track these things longitudinally. And what you can see there in the red and the blue line is really showing that in the first year that we were measuring this, and these were children when they were year 8, that their school climate, their perceived support, and their own perception of their happiness fed into, a year later, their sense of school identification. So how much they felt they belonged and that the school was for them. And then if you look a year ahead into the future then, that their level of self-identification with their school was then related with a whole range of more academic concepts such as the behavioural and emotional engagement with their school. So we're really, once again, trying to unpack the mechanism between wellbeing and learning, because we know that the research has shown us it's important, but we need to think about how, so that we can then support schools to think about where should they put their efforts into addressing that. Now, the third thing I want to highlight is that challenge that schools have in terms of how do they know what to do? That they're offered a lot of different things. In Victoria, they've got the school mental health menu, they've got the BU programs directory. There's a lot of different websites that say we've got all these menus that tell you where the evidence sits. So we went and asked teachers in a different study, and this was led by one of my PhD students, Lilia, where she looked at teachers and said, like, what is it that you're looking for when you're choosing between different programs? So these are our 8 things. What do you think were our top 3? Any guesses from the audience? Costs? So getting costs these were the top 3. And we got them to rank, they got to tell us what the factors were, and they then got to tell us what mattered most to them. And out of these 3 that I've highlighted, that the thing that came out the highest ranked was age appropriateness. The teachers told us they hated programs or approaches which were designed for a different age group that were then being advocated for them without the evidence. So things that were designed for high school students being pushed into primary schools or vice versa, or into early childhood. They said they want age-appropriate support and age-appropriate evidence. The second one was relevant to their student context. They hated approaches that said, do this for everyone, and this one intervention has to be in every school. They really pushed back on that and said, actually, our schools have different needs based on our students, based on our data. So they want to be able to select a program or an approach which meets the needs of their students, which isn't very surprising, but really important to highlight. And evidence came in 3rd. So it really shows that they want to make sure something's developmentally appropriate, meets the needs of their students, and then they'll look at the evidence later on. And implementation, we kept asking, what about implementation? Like, if it's the right program for our students, we will make it work. So it really highlights that aspect. Now, one of the last things I want to think about as well is we think about schools as a wellbeing workforce. This is data that numbers that I've been able to gain from national bodies that have over the years asked about how many of their personnel are working in schools. So at a national level, there are 4,500 psychologists who say they work in schools. This is only second to the private sector, so it's more than schools and community services. So it's actually about 30 to 35% of psychologists that say they work in schools. The similar number to speech pathologists. Once again, they work in schools in language disorders, and they say they're in the schools. Just over 1,500 school nurses reported to be in there. We know there's 250 GPs. We don't know how many OTs, social workers, or paediatricians. So once again, anyone have any data, please let me know. As well as what I've highlighted in green is that we also don't know exactly how many teachers are in wellbeing roles. In Victoria, we're very fortunate where one of the projects that I'm involved in that's led by Oberklaid is the Mental Health in Primary Schools project. So we can be confident telling you there's about 1,800 mental health and wellbeing leaders in schools. But within that role, and what's unique about that role, is that those teachers have protected time to lead the wellbeing initiatives within their primary school. But we don't know how many unofficial or those who don't have protected time. And if you're anything like me, not having protected time to do something, it's really hard to do. So one of the things that we're thinking about now as part of my team is thinking about how do we map what these models do, who's working with who, what does it look like, and not necessarily trying to find one model that fits everyone, but think about essentially at a practice level, how do we get these workforces to work together, but also how do we get them to work with the families, and because families are just as important as well as are they working with classroom teachers. It's great to be in a school, it's great if your workforce is in the school, but are you actually engaging with the teachers? And are you engaging with the families? Or are you there having your clinic and in isolation? And we don't know, which is scary to me. So I'm going to finish off. So this is my second last slide. But this was a report that Sharon Goldfeld and I released a few years ago called the Reinventing Schools report, where we were really trying to think about how do we advance the understanding of wellbeing in schools and the role of schools. And that we really had this overriding principle thinking about the whole child, so think about all the aspects of wellbeing, but also the whole school approach. So not thinking about just the simple role, not just the role of teachers, but about the whole school ecosystem, from the environment to who's going through the door to that partnership with families. And how do we ensure that a system-level approach is supported? And through that principle, we really came up with 4 driving principles. The one is that we have to think flexibly, but also co-design and co-develop evidence-informed approaches that can work within different contexts that work for the students that it's trying to support. Thinking about the skills that students need. So instead of schools doing things to students, how do we build up the skills and capabilities of students? And how do we know students are walking away from school with capabilities of lifelong learning and lifelong wellbeing? About building that engaging culture that brings together health and wellbeing and learning in schools, where families and teachers and everyone in the school is on board and advancing things together. And then that relational aspect, we can't forget how important wellbeing and a lot of the fundamentals of wellbeing are really relational in nature. So how we interact with each other becomes just as important of kind of what we're doing with each other. And I just want to finish off with this quote from a PhD that Al Giles Kay just finished up, and she just got her PhD a few weeks ago, so she's super excited, where we think about that wellbeing is this complex thing where we need complex change, but Al's work, and this is Child Voice, an 8-year-old girl, which simply shared what seems like a simple strategy we could all use, but think about implementation can be a bit challenging at times. But as you can see through this girl's quote, she doesn't leave anyone out. It's adults and children, and how we interact today is what she had was that one thing that her school could do that can support her mental health and wellbeing. And this is my favourite quote from Al's PhD. So we're now going to kind of move on to our panel discussion. But I hope I've given you some food for thought and thinking about the complexities that we have in terms of supporting wellbeing in schools, both from that what is wellbeing to the complexities of what a school's being asked to do and who's actually part of the conversation. So I'm now going to introduce our panel. And I'll get them to come up and sit in the allocated spot. So first is Frank Oberklaid. Frank was the foundation director of not only the Mental Health in Primary Schools initiative, but also of the Centre for Community Child Health. Frank has a bio which is way too long for me to remember, but most recently Frank has been chairing things such as the National Child and Adolescent Mental Health Strategy and Thriving Kids in Australia. And Frank has been one of the forefront leaders in terms of thinking about wellbeing, but he's also been a very big advocate on how we work with schools and what does that look like. So Frank, come on. So next we've got Professor Sharon Goldfeld. So Sharon is the current director of the Centre for Community Child Health, as well as the lead for the population health group population health theme down at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. So once again, Sharon has really been a big advocate where she spent time in government and now she's an academic, so she kind of sees both sides and really think about how do we be provocative, but also impactful in the way that we support wellbeing. So Sharon, thank you. And finally, and not least, we've got Stephen Fraser. So Stephen is the DepSec of school education programs and support. So the wellbeing portfolio fits within Stephen's remit, and that over the years he's been leading and advocating for changes in certain areas around wellbeing and has really that insights into what's happening at the policy level and kind of how does that feed down into the classroom. So thank you, Stephen. Let me just sit down and... So before we kind of throw to questions, but I guess reflections from the panel from, I guess, some of the provocations or some of the concepts I raised.
We agree. Does this work? We agree with all of them, John. Didn't we train you?
Yeah, sorry. So I did my PhD in Frank and Sharon Centre, sorry. Yes.
This is all set up right from the beginning.
John, I didn't train you, John.
No, you didn't.
I could have listened to you for the rest of the evening. It was just fantastic to see some of the insights. And I think particularly the teacher voice and the student voice come through. So thank you.
And I think you highlighted maybe it's the elephant in the room, which is this wellbeing learning nexus and directionality, and trying to unpack some of that over time, which comes first. Horse, cart, horse. And I think there's been interesting work you've done and others have done to try and work out, do you work on wellbeing for learning, or do you work on learning for wellbeing, or do you do both? And how does an education system do that?
So I guess going to enough about me, I think I want to kind of deflect to the panel and some of the work that the panel's been really highlighting. So I guess, Frank, I'll start with you because you're next to me. One of the things you've recently been on is the Thriving Kids initiative, and that through that initiative, there's been a lot of talk about, well, what does this mean for schools? And I know you've been doing a lot of consultations and talking to schools about what does it mean? So I guess what have been some of, the key messages that you're getting from schools or key learnings you're getting as you talk to principals and teachers around what is Thriving Kids?
Well, let me answer it this way, and I'll get to the nub of your question. If you look at times when we start to get concerned about kids' development and behaviour, there are three sort of peaks. One is in the first 6-12 months of life, and they're mainly kids with severe additional needs, birth injury, congenital abnormalities, birth defects, etc., etc. The next peak is 2, 3, 4 years of age, when children go to early learning, they go to playgroups, etc., and parents first become aware, they compare their kids with other kids, and professionals observe these children for the first time. The next time is school. And preschool and school, there's a smattering of more severe issues, but that's when mild and moderate needs are going to be picked up. So if Thriving Kids' focus is on picking up children where they live, learn and play, then early childhood educational settings and school settings are the logical place. And there are other attractions. So on our expert working group, we had 2 teachers, Angela Falkenberg, who's head of the Australian Primary Principals Association, and Sam Page, who's CEO of Early Childhood Australia. A lot of educational input. There's another principal of a special school. And what we learned from them, and we picked up along the way anyhow, was schools didn't like NDIS. It was a therapy-driven model, and it drove schools crazy because dozens of therapists would arrive at the school every day, and school leadership had to devote literally a whole person organising schedules and where they're going to fit. They hated that sort of model, and the idea that there was a different model, there was a lot of acclaim for that. I guess the other thing is the Thriving Kids model empowers teachers. The Thriving NDIS had major flaws. One of it was it disempowered teachers because teachers couldn't make a diagnosis. They had to refer to people like Sharon and I. And the notion that Sharon and I spend half an hour with a child and know the child better than a teacher is nonsensical. So Thriving Kids is designed to pick up problems early. So for most of these children with wellbeing issues and developmental issues, they don't suddenly emerge. And kids don't appear with a sign on their forehead saying, I've got a mental health problem. Teachers pick these kids up very early, a learning difficulty, social problems, et cetera, et cetera. So they're in an ideal position to pick up problems early and build scaffolding around these kids. And teachers know what to do. So, with MIPS, we'll come on to this later, what we're trying to do is to de-expert the expert model and make parents and particularly teachers the experts. So Thriving Kids, to the best of my knowledge, has been applauded by schools. They're a bit worried about the extra workload, that's understandable. But in terms of individual teachers, it puts them where they should be as experts with children, because they see these children in the classroom, on the playground, interacting with peers. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. Generally, schools see it very positively.
And I think, Frank, you kind of raised 2 really interesting things from what you were saying as well, is that it's really part of reinventing kids, or what we need to think about in terms of the implementation, is how do we uplift teachers? So how do we ensure that teachers have the right skills, and what does that look like? But also not discounting kind of the skills that teachers already have. Like, it's really frustrating from my perspective when you go in and people say, oh, I'm doing this training with teachers because they don't know this thing. When we actually know teachers know a lot. Teachers can identify, they don't necessarily have to name, but they can pick up the students who they know needs additional support and know about whether that's something they can provide in the classroom or whether it's something that someone else in the school or someone external can provide. So I think that's part of where I see the opportunity for Thriving Kids, is really think about how do we uplift teachers so that they can essentially be able to support more students and have targeted support to support certain other students as well, and really working together.
I should just declare I hate the word uplift. It sounds like a woman's foundational garment.
So let's call it capability
Frank and
building.
I don't agree on this.
So
Just call it increase the skills of.
yeah, well, increasing the skills of teachers, uplifting their capabilities. I can't stop using the word now. Thanks, Frank. So I guess that what Thriving Kids and what you're talking about, Frank, is kind of really also aligns with some of the work, Sharon, that you've been doing around we published a report recently, or not recently, a few years ago, called Reinventing Schools, but it's something that you've been talking about from as long as I've known you around, that we need to get schools to think about wellbeing and learning together, and that how they relate to each other. But I guess one thing I'm interested in from your thoughts is that when we think about reinventing schools, what do we actually mean? And what might be some concrete examples that you think we should start thinking about in terms of what does it look like to appreciate wellbeing and learning together?
Thanks very much, John. And we have been on this journey together. And I should put a shout out also to Pasi Salberg, who's also part of the faculty. I feel sometimes I've been on this journey with Pasi. It's like one of those jokes, like a paediatrician and an educator go into a bar. And it's been a great privilege, actually, to walk alongside educators to think about what does reinventing Australian schools look like. And you noticed we haven't said Australian teachers, we've said Australian schools, a place where kids go every day of the week for many, many hours. And I just want to acknowledge exactly what Frank was saying, that teachers have this extraordinary ability to be in front of children, but they also hold a great kind of moral distress, because they see a lot of things that they often can't do what they want to do. And this is especially in our rural schools where there isn't a lot around them. And so the question is, what can schools do as a kind of institution to make a difference, noting that teachers can't hold all of it? And then it goes to this question, what is the school in terms of what's its relationship to the families, what's its relationship to the services, and of course, what's its relationship to other schools, because often schools have relationships with other schools. And that feels, and there'll be people in the audience that are doing amazing things. Like, we've got plenty of schools that do things, if you don't mind me saying this, Stephen, despite the system, not because of the system. And many will say that they'll just keep their head below the parapet because they're doing all these amazing things. But it's not necessarily quite, haven't quite ticked all the boxes and done everything they're meant to. So I think there's a recognition that schools could and should be somewhat different if, those principles are up there as organising principles. I don't have a model in mind. We can't write in and go, oh, thank goodness we're here. But in that, it sort of goes down to what could schools do kind of differently if there were potentially other professions in the school, or we started with the needs of the child in the middle of it and said, what do these children and families need? And so John and I have been thinking about that with two pieces of work in mind, because one of the things is very hard is for schools to start from scratch and go, I don't really know what that might look like. So one piece we've been looking at is school disengagement and school attendance. And we sort of describe attendance as the symptom and engagement being the kind of disengagement being the disease. But it's really getting to that idea, what is it at the heart of it that means we're seeing a lot of kids leaving public education? What does it kind of mean for what does a school look like if it's a really engaging place and being able to meet diverse needs? And I say that knowing that it's challenging. And the second is, this goes to a concrete example, is what's the role of health interventions to sort of help us think about the integration between children's health, wellbeing and learning. And one of the things we've been thinking about is school lunches. And when we think about school lunches, we're thinking about, it's really interesting with school lunches, because if kids get to co-design what that looks like, they're sort of thinking about food. Maybe you could set up a social enterprise that employs parents to actually make that food. And then kids are sitting around talking to each other. And of course, that's all about social interactions and building their social emotional development and their well-being. So we've been thinking about those sort of things, John, the sort of concrete things that might instigate the sort of thinking that schools have about how things might look different.
I think so.
We're not giving very short answers, are we, John?
No, that's completely fine. We will have time for the audience. I guess I'm going to throw to Stephen now. Sharon said schools are doing things despite the system. But I guess from a systems perspective, that we know that Victoria's been doing a lot of really positive things, a lot of kind of policy changes, but also initiatives that have happened in the last few years. I guess as a policy person, what do you think that, or what do you hope that looks like in schools?
I quite liked the 8-year-old definition. And I think if we could think about how that translates each and every day, it would be a good start. But fundamentally, children and families walk into school each day with particular needs, and we're not going to change those needs before they walk in. Those needs change every day. They change as children develop. They change as family situations evolve, and they're complex. And I think fundamentally what we're trying to do is equip schools, and again, schools, not teachers, schools within that ERACI ecosystem of communities, equipping schools with the capabilities, uplifting if you like, but equipping them with the skills, the knowledge, the resources to respond to whatever the needs are that walk in each day. I think that's what success ultimately looks like for us. The challenge is it's very difficult to predict those needs. They change. They change with each cohort that comes in and enrolls each year. They change as community contexts change. And they change as the world around us changes. The challenges now of social media and devices and AI are very different to what they were even 5-10 years ago. So that challenge of equipping schools with the knowledge, the expertise, the skills to respond to those needs is ever evolving. So I think in terms of what success looks like, it changes all the time. But fundamentally, it's about ensuring that we are constantly asking ourselves, what's needed? What are the needs that are coming into our schools each day? What are the skills that we need? What are the resources? And what are the partnerships that we need to sustain and build and renew in order to respond to those needs? And we do have many of those in place already. I think, just reflecting on one big policy change. John, you put up FISO 2.0, the framework that we use in Victorian government schools now, and it has learning and wellbeing at its heart. FISO 1.0 had learning, engagement and wellbeing, and everyone thought that the central focus of our schooling system was learning. We take away the engagement bit and we say actually engagement is an outcome when we get the learning and the wellbeing right. And subtly, everyone notices the wellbeing as well. And so it's just an interesting shift in the way we think about policy frameworks and the signals that we send to the system about what we value and the extent to which the policy reflects what schools are doing. And yeah, I think our role is really to tap into those really brilliant programs and partnerships that are in place in the system and escalate those so that those that are working, those that show impact, they're what become our system-wide policies.
Thank you, Stephen. I guess this is a question for the panel. I guess one of the biggest criticisms we get as we promote wellbeing within schools and mental health is that we are placing too much burden on teachers, that we're asking teachers to be something that they're not, that we're asking them to diagnose, which I can assure you within MIPS at least, we're not asking to diagnose. We're not asking them to be that clinical support for students. But that is a criticism that wellbeing initiatives take away from learning time. And so I guess how would you respond to that criticism, or what are your thoughts on that criticism? Like, are we taking away from precious learning time if we're spending too much time doing wellbeing?
I'm happy to go first quickly, and I think, Sharon, you put it really well. Is it learning for wellbeing or wellbeing for learning, or both, and to what extent is it both? And it's always both. Children need to be well to learn, and learning success leads to wellbeing. So we can't separate the two. The question of time, though, and expectations for teachers is really complex, and there's an extent to which even without any systemic policy or community expectations or media focused on wellbeing, teachers are responding to the wellbeing needs of children all the time, particularly with the challenges of adolescence. That's what teachers do. They care about children and young people's development, and they focus on wellbeing as part of building success in learning. So that's always going to happen. I think the extent to which we acknowledge that as a system and think about the resources that are needed to do that. And that's where they are age-appropriate resources. They're different for primary schools compared to what they are for secondary. They're different in specialist schools. And, a really challenging aspect for us, they're different for those children who are not engaged in the mainstream system. We have to think about those children, young people as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, Stephen. I think teachers sometimes see wellbeing with a capital W. It's this thing out there they've got to incorporate in their teaching, and I don't have the time and I don't know what to do. But it's the little things that teachers do all of the time, like saying, nice job, Johnny. That's well-being. Or good try. I'm sure you can, or you're having a bad day. I'm having a bad day as well. Tomorrow will be better. Just these everyday little things they're not even in touch with because they do it automatically because they're with kids. So well-being isn't this big thing that they've got to take on. They do it already.
I was just going to add to that couple of things. One is I do want to note that teachers are amazing, and I just, I've done some fabulous work with some rural schools where teachers are the teacher, the parent, the social worker, the everything for these kids, and so that load is really important. And the other thing is, and I think this is why teachers feel the burden is, and I use this analogy. So I'm a developmental paediatrician, but it's like saying, look, on Tuesday, can you be a neurosurgeon? On Friday, can you be a gastroenterologist? Here's 2 hours of training, off you go. And I think that sort of challenge for teachers is very real. So it's probably just worth noting that. But the other thing is, and John and I have been involved with a trial looking at how you might use response to intervention in the classroom, and the ability for teachers to tier what they do, so they're actually able to look at what is the whole classroom. This is about oral language and literacy, and then how do you respond to those kids that need a little bit more. And I think that sort of, we used an implementation support partner. I think Judy Connell's here. We've been doing it in the Catholic schools as well, and it's really interesting to see. This is talking about this kind of skills, and you give people the skills to know how they can actually work with the kids. The language, oral language improves, and the kids' behaviour also improves at the same time. So I think there's lots of things that are out there that will, this is to your point, Frank, about those kind of skills that will make or help teachers think about what they can do, but it's all about their absolute commitment to those kids, and it isn't just about the commitment to literacy, and we just see that all the time.
And I think what all three panels have said, and some of our other work that we're looking at as well, is thinking about skilled development of teachers, so that we know that schools get approached to do a lot of different wellbeing approaches. So you do mindfulness, you do trauma-informed practice, you do social emotional learning. But I think one of the challenges we have at the moment is how do we appreciate that some of these skills take time to develop. You never walk away from a PD saying, I am now an expert the next day, but you need the opportunities to practice those skills. You need to think about how you might contextualise those skills. And that I do wonder whether we're not giving teachers enough time to develop those skills, because the next new shiny thing is going to come through the door in 6 months' time or a year's time. That next program is going to tell you they're the best things since sliced bread. So how do we, I guess, think about skill development from a long-term perspective? And also thinking that within initial teacher training, that we have teachers leaving the university with certain skills, but what are their training needs and how do we support actually growth of their skills as well? But I guess thoughts?
Can I be a little bit provocative?
Of course.
I still think we have to be mindful of not putting the whole burden on teachers. And I just want to keep going back to this school thing. Because I think being a teacher is really tough. Like, I don't know what it's... I know what it's like to take a group of kids. I don't know what it's like to stand in front of a group of kids or work with a group of kids, large numbers of children. But I want to sort of think about, or maybe ask us to think about the whole school. And so not just how do we... Like, I think teachers want to have a level of comfort in being able to do the things they're doing and to deal with who's in front of them. But they're going to have much more comfort if we think about what's all the skills they've got in that school, who else is around, who else can they call on, like we would in any setting. Like it is in my setting. I know I can go and talk to other people who've got other skills that can help me do my job. So I don't feel I have to carry all the skills myself. So I'm not saying that isn't... I'm not saying, and I'm sure no one in this room would not think that there's a role for teachers thinking about the entire skill set you need for the modernity of the children that we're seeing, who are more complex, but that has to be hand in glove, in my view, with what are all the skill sets of all the people that you need in this setting called schools, that is going to make it easier for everyone to do their jobs. That's a bit provocative to your comment, so sorry about that.
Can I be provocative?
Yeah.
In paediatrics, there's this notion called the new morbidity, and it refers to the fact that over the last several decades, the sort of problems that coming to paediatricians have changed drastically. So paediatric practice now is 70% plus developmental, behavioural, psycho issues, family issues, etc., which reflects changes in society. For a long time now, for several decades, you can't become a paediatrician, a consultant paediatrician, without specific training in those areas. So I wrote an editorial a decade ago called The New Morbidity in Education. And I posed the question, paediatrics has come to grips with the changes in society, the changes in the way children present, etc. And most paediatricians would feel confident in this area. I posed the question, have educators embraced the new morbidity? Is there a new morbidity in education? And what I hear from educational colleagues, comments that you made too, Stephen, is student needs have changed, family needs have changed. So teaching isn't now what it was 20, 30 years ago. Have universities embraced the new morbidity in their training? I don't know whether that they have. Do they teach wellbeing? Do they teach family issues? Do they teach the social gradient, family violence? All the things that children, all the baggage that families and children accumulate before they even start school. So when we say a teacher's equipped to deal with these, have they addressed the new morbidity in education?
And I think, Frank, that there's been kind of social changes that kind of fill into that as well. Like, I do a lot of work with Matt Harrison, and he leads a lot of our faculty's work around neurodivergent children. And even that concept is relatively new, and people are trying to learn about what does that mean for teaching practice. And that's where some of these changes could potentially put teachers in a situation where what you were doing 10 years ago isn't what you should be doing today. And that your approach that you thought was evidence-informed 10 years ago is no longer evidence-informed or socially acceptable now. So I think that's what you say, Frank, is the complexity as we change as a society, change as a population, there's kind of changes in workforce that we need to think about as well. And once again, how do we support that change?
Workforces,
yeah.
So Tim Moore, who some of you may know, who works with Sharon and I and John in the centre, coined the notion of social climate change. And he says that the conditions under which families are rearing children are totally different than they were several decades ago, which speaks to your point.
John, you've put up the workforces slide earlier. Number of psychologists, number of nurses, number of GPs working in schools. And
I do have to say there's teachers aren't there, but they're there.
Yeah. But, and I think we have seen, particularly in Victoria, we've had 200 million invested in the mental health in primary schools program. We've had 200 million invested in the mental health fund and menu. We've had investment in mental health practitioners. We've got GPs in schools, in 100 of the schools serving the most disadvantaged communities. We've got breakfast clubs. We've got nurses. We've got Triple S. We've got so many initiatives that build on and support teachers in their classroom practice. What we haven't done, though, is got a framework to describe what the complement of expertise, a full workforce working to support a school of a given size and complexity would look like. And what are the operating models? What are the clinical practice models? What are the information exchange models that guide that work? I think it feels very much like that is the next phase of work for us. We've got initiative on initiative that's building up to this point where we now have more resources and workforces working alongside teachers, vacancies aside, retention, attrition aside, but we have a point where we can now describe what is that full complement of expertise of working around a school. And I think, Sharon, your work towards full service schools serving wider communities, take us there.
If you keep going with the paediatric example, we now know the best care for kids is multidisciplinary care. So it isn't just me as the paediatrician, but all the different professions that need to work together or in a way that's going to help that child and the family.
Yeah. And just an example of that is a work that Gihan Roberts and I have been doing at the Royal Children's Hospital, where they have a multidisciplinary clinic for learning difficulties, where years ago there was a teacher involved. There isn't a teacher at the moment, but we were able to run a project for the last 2 years where we had one of our Masters of Learning Intervention graduates embedded within that hospital clinic. And her responsibility was to talk to the schools as the child was going through the assessment process, learn about what the school's doing, what have they done, what has worked, what hasn't worked, feeding that into the assessment process, and then ensuring that whatever the clinical recommendations were from the paediatrician and psychologist weren't replicating what the school had already done, but were also feasible for the school to implement, because she got to know the setting in which the student was going to be supported once they were back. And I think that's another model where we have to think outside the boundaries of how do we work together to support the wellbeing of all students, and how do we kind of share that expertise as well. And another piece of work I just want to highlight from Hannah Stark, who's one of the postdocs in the faculty, where she's really highlighted that we know leadership is important in terms of how you sustain practice at the school level. But what she really found through her work was showing that leadership who are able to disperse responsibility and actually increase the responsibility across all the people within the school, so there's that shared understanding, shared commitment. Those were the early childhood centres that she was working in, where the practices stuck for more than 10 years. It's that not letting one person hold everything, but having a workforce that can disperse understanding, disperse awareness. And I think like mental health in primary schools, and I'm biased, and Frank is thinking about that dispersion, that we've got this MHOL whose responsibility is to uplift. Sorry, I keep using the word, but to upskill everyone within the school. So I do want to leave time now for questions from the audience. So I think there's a roaming mic. So I guess we're really inviting questions from the audience, and you can either direct them to the panel or provocations as well. But we do request that you're asking questions. Yeah.
Thanks so much for this discussion. Just touching on the point around teachers being asked to do a lot more and being very time poor, was curious to get your thoughts on an alternate school model that I've seen out of the US called Alpha School, where they're using sort of AI as the teacher and the tutor. So they deliver like a personalised lessons, and they do 2 hours on an iPad each day. And then the rest of the time, they spend on life skill projects. So the teacher will, go for a hike, teach them how to change a tire on a car, or run a food truck business as an example, where their kind of emphasis is on a lot of the lessons can be given, like the curriculum and some of the basic stuff like maths can be done through this model to free up the teacher to spend more time on the human skills. I'm curious to know if you've heard of this and what you think of this model going forward.
I'm a paediatrician and I'm very careful to stay in my lane mostly. And we tell our trainees, your paediatricians, don't tell teachers how to teach. Don't tell teachers a child should remain. You can make some general recommendations. My own old-fashioned view is that nothing replaces face-to-face relationships. That a teacher eyeballing a child makes the difference. It's much better than online. Having said that, I don't feel qualified to comment on that.
I'll respond very quickly, and yeah, I have some familiarity with the model. I think the question of age appropriateness is really important, and again, to Frank's point about that, the value of the human relationship and the trust that supports the learning that can develop. I'd be incredibly anxious in a primary environment, but of course, as children grow older, they develop more agency, they develop more responsibility for their own learning. Using tools like AI, and particularly AI tutoring, there is emerging evidence, particularly for disadvantaged or cohorts experiencing disadvantage, that it can be really, really helpful. But I think with caution is always the note alongside AI at the moment, or other models where anytime we diminish the experience or the extent to which a young person is spending time with a qualified, experienced teacher, just makes me nervous.
I can quote someone else, so I'll stay in my lane but use somebody else's lane. Alan Finkel, who used to be the Chief Scientist of Australia, recently gave a talk and talked about the disruption of AI in particular. And what he really talked about was the concerns about AI, to your point, Frank, disrupting human interactions and the importance and the skills one needs for humanity to have those human interactions. And he was noting that in primary schools, and some of the wealthier primary schools in particular, you know how it used to be the first to have the iPad and the first to have the computers? Now they're the first to take away the iPads, take away the computers, and saying kids just need to be able to have those human interactions and not rely on those IT technologies. So it's going to be so interesting to see the way we don't really know, I guess, where AI is going to go. And I think the example of the Alpha School is really interesting. But I just thought it was a really interesting flip on where we were 15 years ago.
Yeah, and I do think we have to kind of think about, like, AI is here. We're not going to get rid of it, I don't think. But we have to kind of think about when can it be a tool that really supports learning and what does it look like? And once again, think about how do we support teachers to know when is an appropriate time to use AI. And I'm going to highlight an analogy that one of my colleagues, Hannah, was shared with me at a conference where we were in a session talking about AI and the challenges and the opportunities. And she shared this analogy where, like, if you think about children and learning maths, you don't want to give them a calculator in grade prep. You don't want that to be their first learning opportunity, is a calculator. You want them to learn the fundamentals. And I've got a year one student who's learning about multiplication and maths, and we're working with him to kind of go through understanding concepts and the process and how you learn it. And then once you understand the fundamentals, that's when AI can really help accelerate or complement your learning as well. Because you can, critique whether the AI is actually giving you the right answer, as well as you can think about what quality outputs, as well as what quality inputs you can give to it, and whether the outputs you're getting are quality as well. But I think it's a really complex space and evolving, and I think we can't necessarily jump all in, but we can't say no AI either. We have to kind of work out. And this is where I think rapid learning is really helpful. It's like we want to test lots of different models. It'll be interesting to kind of see Alpha Schools in a year's time, whether students feel that they're engaged and that they're learning as well. But we need to test these models and to learn quickly and to share quickly as well. So, yeah.
Of the child's mental health and so on is very much determined by the family. The teacher's relationship with the parents hasn't been discussed, I don't think, and their responsibilities, or do they have responsibilities in relation to dealing with mental health problems resulting from the parents? What should they be doing about that?
So probably two thoughts for me. There's some really good research that came out of the US. I can't remember the author, back in the 80s and 90s, which showed that having a high quality, strong school climate where teachers were supporting students was a protective factor to what was happening at home. It doesn't mean that the school is completely buffering everything that's happening at home, but it does alleviate some of the challenges that students might face. So I think that kind of highlights that if you've got a family who isn't engaged in the school, having a really strong school climate still offers some positive outcomes for the students. But I think one thing that we're learning through the Mental Health in Primary Schools project that Frank and I are involved in is that school-family partnerships are really essential. You want the parents to have the same language, the common language with the school, so that when the teachers are talking about their child, or when the parents are sharing about their child, that they have a common understanding of how do we describe what we're seeing with this child. as well as we want, where possible, what the school's doing, like the lessons that, and once again, with my children, coming home saying, oh, I'm learning about this thing or this thing. As a parent, you want to complement what's happening there and to encourage those skills as well. So I think that school-family partnership is really essential when you can have it. But we know that there's sometimes that's a challenge, getting parents to engage with the school. But, sorry, I don't know who I'm pointing to for questions.
With the benefits of clearly like a multidisciplinary profession and a better supported profession, there comes costs with that as well. And obviously Victoria's put in a lot of money into this at the moment. But we're also experiencing probably one of the most resource constrained environments for education departments in the past 15 years, I would say, maybe longer than that. With changes to NDIS and Thriving Kids, we're also going to see fluctuating sort of funding happening in that sort of space. So both on a risk and opportunity frame, on the risk side, do we have the funding flows to be able to support schools to do this? And on the opportunity frame, and I'm seeing this in certain sort of circles, is how could, Stephen, you be talking to your colleagues in Department of Health to sort of match funding? How can we look at the development of new sort of growth areas and match funding in a whole range of different sort of department sort of funding flows coming from Commonwealth and state? So I'm just really interested in what are the opportunities here and what are the risks we're going to have to sort of get through to make this possible?
I think I can only answer in terms of the context that we're in at the moment. So Victoria is the only state yet to sign a multi-year bilateral agreement with the Commonwealth on the Better Fairer Schools Agreement, and we have to do that by the end of the year. So it's all opportunity in terms of securing a long-term funding deal for the state for education. But I think you're absolutely right to say, well, that's the education part. What about the other, the other portfolios? And it is great. I mean, drawing on Frank's work through the Thriving Kids advisory group, the work that we are doing in Victoria at the moment to design Thriving Kids and what it looks like across the system 0 to 8 is very much in partnership with Families, Fairness and Housing and the Department of Health. Some of you may have seen an announcement a couple of weeks ago from Minister for Children, Minister for Disability, Minister Blanthorne, that Thriving Kids will be state-led. And it will be delivered in partnership with maternal and child health nurses and delivered alongside schools and early childhood centres. So that partnership approach, there's completely agree with you, such opportunity. It's emergent, but there is so much we can do there. And I do think, again, drawing on, maybe not despite the system, but alongside the system, there are so many examples. I know Sharon from our place is here. Fantastic model developed in Victoria where we have multiple departments, not just state departments but Commonwealth as well, represented in those communities to really ask what does this community need and how can we align resources to meet those needs.
So I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Sorry.
Thanks, guys. This has been a really fascinating chat and I think particularly piggybacking off the last question about risk, opportunity, cost and how that plays into everything, but also coming back to something, Stephen, you were saying earlier about there being a lot of initiatives that are on the go at the moment and a lot of things being trialled, and there's a lot of complexity in this environment in terms of how we support schools, communities in this space. I'm interested to understand, and again, maybe the answer to this is we're not sure yet, but to what extent do you think that securing some of the long-term funding that we've just been speaking about might actually hinge on having a kind of more holistic framework set aside by the department to actually look at all of these different components and pieces of wellbeing in a school environment, making those recommendations for schools to then kind of hinge that funding on? Is it kind of cart before horse, or how do you see all of that?
I'm happy to go, but Frank, you can take this one. My view would not be that there's contingency here, that the securing long-term funding agreement with the Commonwealth is not hinging on the development of frameworks such as that. I think there's enough cues in the Better Fairer Schools Agreement drawing on what work is underway in Victorian schools, that we can build the constellation around that. And I think that's a way of saying the work is yet to be done, but the work is yet to be done only because it draws upon the work that's already in place. Just because we haven't described the national coherent framework, I love John's analogy on the toothbrushes. Getting every state and territory to sign up to a single framework is not going to happen. Each jurisdiction loves their own and is not going to use someone else's toothbrush. So I think we can be confident that there's enough underway in Victoria, that we've got the building blocks, we can describe those, articulate them, the impact that they're having, and be confident that that's enough to convince the Commonwealth, others, ministers, that yeah, we know what we're doing and it works, we just need to secure those funds to keep going with it.
So I think we've got time for one more. Yeah. So
sensitive content warning. The Faculty of Education wishes to advise that the following question mentions confronting themes of youth trauma. The content may not be suitable for children or all people and may cause distress. Viewer, listener, reader, and parental or carer discretion is advised.
Hello, I'd like to first of all say thank you for your time this evening and everything you've discussed. I've been in education for 20 years as a teacher and a principal. And first of all, Stephen, I'd like to say a lot of people say things against the department, but especially through COVID, there's so much that you guys do and provide that is so helpful in the capacity that you can, and it is very much appreciated. There's a lot of it. As you said, the climate of the kids and what's happening in school has changed a lot. My question is around, there seems to be just that small gap. Is as a principal, yes, I look after your parents as much as your children, but you also look after your staff. And when you have or your teachers who have 40% of their classes needs, which includes grade 3 children cutting, it includes suicide, it includes sexual abuse, domestic violence, children who are attacking them and the other children every day. We all know what goes on. But my whole thing is, we need to put the oxygen mask on ourselves before we can put it on the others. The teachers and the ES do the most amazing job. They know exactly what's going on with the kids and the families, and they don't work 9 to 3:30. It's usually 8 to 9 p.m. So my question is, in all of this talk about wellbeing, is there going to be a bit more attention to the wellbeing of our staff? For example, as you said, the relevance of a lot of things on the mental health might not apply. We are given specific money to spend on the mental health menu, but when there's nothing for us to spend it on, I'm wondering whether there can be a couple of things added to that menu which actually supports your staff, whether that's time out, whether that's counselling. They deal with a lot of traumatic stuff, and there's an EPA, but there's nowhere to debrief. But they are the ones struggling. They are carrying the children. It's not so much, have they got the skills? Do we need to reskill our teachers? No, we need to support our teachers. So I'm just wondering if there's any part of this wellbeing that's there for them.
If I had the money, if Sharon and I had the money, we'd increase your budget by 500%.
So absolutely appreciate the need, and it is important. Sharon called it out earlier. We can't make an assumption. I love the late Richard Elmore's way of describing to do more, we need to know more. That is absolutely true, but there is a limit. There is a limit on what we can ask our teachers to do. And it's not just enough to provide them with the skills, the training, the expertise. We need to provide the very, very tangible support. And yes, they can't support students if they can't be well themselves. So the more clinical answer is there's been recent funding invested in staff wellbeing. We now have a team of staff within the department of the regional offices to respond to acute incidents of workplace violence and aggression. That is having impact in some schools. We need to grow that work. I'm not going to get the precise figure, but somewhere in the order to 40 to 60 million has been invested over the last 2 budgets in staff wellbeing and responsive support as well. So counselling for more acute moments, but also preventative support as well. So very, very happy to chat afterwards about what that looks like. Yeah, thank you.
So I think that's, I'm sorry that we've run out of time for questions. So I was always hesitant whether we would get enough questions, but we're getting lots. So that everyone can walk out at 7:30, we're gonna close the questions for now, but feel free to kind of come down and talk to the panel once they're done. But next I'm gonna invite up Georgia to kind of close us out.
Thanks, John, and good evening, everyone. I have the absolute pleasure of giving the vote of thanks to our panellists tonight and to reflect on some of the key messages, which I'm looking forward to doing with you. There is a lot to unpack, but before I reflect in more detail, I really just want to start by acknowledging, I guess, the meeting of the minds tonight and the expertise that we've borne witness to. If we could just really put our hands together again for Stephen, Sharon, Frank and John to recognise the generosity of our So I might go through each of them if I can. And John, I'm going to start with you. And I think that you might have an alternate career as a TV host. That was great facilitating. But also I wanted to congratulate you for initial setting of the scene to sort of shape things for us and to providing some of that data and that information that you're so closely working on. To give us a bit of an idea of some of the issues that we're working with. I was comforted to see that wellbeing was talked about back so far and considered such an integral part of a teacher's role. But the three sort of pointy things that popped up for me in what you said is kind of the what, how do we define wellbeing? And that's a slippery concept and it's different depending on the context in which we are. And a really big part of what you talked about is that relationship between wellbeing and learning and getting that right in a deep way, okay? When we measure it, are we talking about wellbeing or mental health or engagement? And thinking about that longitudinally and some of the gaps that we have in our research there. I think also that juxtaposition between that complexity of ideas which we've talked about tonight and the complexity of the solutions and the simplicity of what is needed through the lens of a child. Everyone just be kind, job done, right? So thank you. To our panellists, Stephen, thank you for bringing a policy and a government lens to the discussion tonight. I don't think we could have done it without you. We are inextricably linked in the work that we do in research and with government, and I think that's really important. And one of the things that really stuck out for me in what you talked about is the way you conceptualise that needs for students in schools change all the time, and the skills and the resources that schools need are dynamic. We can't just decide we've got the greatest thing and pop it in and think that that's going to solve all the problems. So my job as a researcher is to wrap evidence around experience and to create new knowledge. And thinking about what you said around that dynamics and the change is how do we design research that captures real-time data on a rolling basis and harnesses that dynamism and that need that we need to provide to schools. So I think one of the key skills for us is that openness to flexibility. The other thing you said was that wellbeing is there whether or not we shine a light on it, and teachers are doing that work. Sharon, your bold idea around reinventing schools has had me thinking about what that could look like for some time, and it's an ambitious endeavour, but tonight I've really felt that that ambition was matched with some of the detail and the nuance and the concreteness, and that program of ideas that you and John are thinking about testing as part of reinventing schools. And it could be something as simple as really a nudge intervention, like a school lunch or a school breakfast to get kids through the door, or something more complex. But I think the clarification from you that the focus is on schools and not on teachers, and how mindful you are about not burdening the teacher, and avoiding that by thinking about what are the other roles in the school that we can bring to the table in the support of students. And finally, Frank, who I've worked with for a long time, and you're always generous with your time and your expertise and your visionary thinking. I want to thank you for illuminating the perspectives of the schools about NDIS and some of the frustrations that we're going to see address with Thriving Kids. But you are always empowering teachers to be in the care conversation as an expert alongside others. So thank you. And when I think about what the three of you are working on and talking about tonight, I feel like you're shifting these tectonic plates together, and that things are going to sort of reshift the landscape in terms of how we go forward through that social climate change that you talked about, Frank. I also want to thank and congratulate everyone here for coming along. It shows a commitment to young people and to our education system, and your contribution tonight to the dialogue and exchange of some really, really important ideas. You went all the places. So you threw up some interesting ideas around alternate models. Of course, AI came into it, and thinking about what are the roles of parents and how do we find that common language in a school that helps parents access the more difficult conversations about how they might be going and raising a child. And you asked the question that I wanted to ask around that connection between government and how do we build connected models and partnership, which seems really logical but sometimes can be a bit more difficult in reality. And I think finally we sort of heard that reality of what schools are working with day to day, and as a psychologist as well as a researcher I hear about them too, and some of them are really heartbreaking, and it feels like it's getting complicated as we go. So I think just to sort of bring this together collectively, some of the really key things I'd like to reiterate or raise up that were heard tonight is this notion of uplifting teachers, sorry Frank, I've used the word, appreciating their knowledge and experience in the process of child development, not just as observers, but as influencers of child development and good mental health. The other thing I heard was kids have something to say in this, and we need to capture that and make sure that they have a voice in it. The social climate change really stuck out for me. What does this mean for schools and for teachers, and what does it mean for initial teacher education? And we need to work together to understand how we respond to that. And something that I think we all think about, well certainly I've been thinking about from a research perspective, is that economic and service model, which you mentioned, Stephen, of what it takes to service a whole school community. What does that look like? What does it cost? Who is involved? It'd be great to get that information. So I thought I would end tonight on the things that I felt united us all here. I think that's a nice spot to finish. I think we probably all have a commitment to wanting more or better for our young people. We seem that we've got attention on and an empathy for the load and burden on schools, but particularly the load and burden on teachers, and that teachers are amazing, but we need to look after their wellbeing as much as we're looking after the wellbeing of our students. And then I think finally the fact that we're all here together having the conversation means that we care, and we want to progress this and move this forward. So I think if we can hang on to those unifying components while we navigate some of the complexity and remember to listen to the kids, that feels like a really hopeful approach for supporting our schools and our teachers and our young people. So with that, and as I hand out some gifts of appreciation, could you please join me again in thanking Frank, Sharon, Stephen and John.
Thank you, Georgia. And before we conclude, I would really like to also encourage you to continue these conversations through the Faculty of Education's Talking Teaching podcast that you can access through our website or your favorite app, or scan the QR code. And I know that our tonight's guests will be speaking there. And this really concludes tonight's event. Thank you, everybody, for attending and for your questions and engagement. We hope to see you back soon for the next Dean's lecture here at the Faculty of Education, University of Melbourne. Please scan the QR code on the screen to keep informed on upcoming education events. Thank you and travel safely. Thank you.